Well, hello and welcome to today's episode of Rock Enroll, the enrollment marketing podcast from Vision Point Marketing. I'm Katie Campbell, Chief Client Officer here at Vision Point, and I'm joined today by Matt Walters, one of Vision Point's senior consultants and my go-to strategic soundboard. So today we're going to do a quick current state on how the relationships with OPMs in the higher ed industry is evolving. I speak with clients all day, every day. Matt has worked not only on campus, but is constantly talking with institutional leaders and marketers about what's going on and what they should do. So, Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Katie. This will be fun.
Yeah. So just to get started, I know you've worked your career in this world. I think maybe if we could start with the foundation of the foundation. What even is an OPM for those who don't know? And how did these type of partnerships between institutions and OPMs come about?
Yeah, absolutely. OPMs, OPM stands for Online Program Management. So OPMs are companies that basically help institutions offer and deliver online education. And, I know there's a lot of controversy surrounding OPM. Sometimes the rhetoric can get pretty charged pretty quickly, but I don't know. I think it's important to remember, like, especially in the beginning, OPMs were offering a really valuable service to schools. Most schools didn't have the infrastructure or the capacity in the early days of online learning to quickly pivot and take programs online, and OPMs provided that service. They helped many institutions, stay relevant and serve their students in this new way, kind of in the early days of online learning. Um, that said, over the decades that OPMs have been around, the relationship between OPMs and the institutions of themselves has gotten really complicated, pretty fraught. A lot of controversy surrounding it, especially recently, these last few years. And I don't know about you, Katie, but yeah, I feel like every other day right now when I'm talking with client partners, this question of what should we think about our OPMs? They're considering maybe pulling back from the relationships they've had with their OPMs. It's definitely a hot conversation right now. So anything we can do to help provide some perspective on that, I think would be great.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Whether it's like institutional change, as in they're trying to reconsider their program offering, program mix, or even just new leadership on campus who might not be as familiar. Maybe they're coming from an industry outside higher ed, and it's like, what are these very long-standing historic agreements we've been in? To your point, I think it's very fair to call out. It provided a lot of benefits to the institution and their students at one time when online education was so in demand as we continue to see it to be. But I'm curious, when did the conversation start changing? When did it really start evolving into more so the desire to maybe think differently about online program managers or even online offerings as a whole?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the questions and the rumblings have been there for a long time. Um, in part because of how OPMs are compensated, and in part because of just the fundamental, um, the nature of OPM businesses and how they differ from most higher ed institutions. So, I mean, most institutions are not for profit. They exist to serve their students. OPMs are for-profit companies looking to make money. Um, that's a pretty significant, fundamental difference at the root of all of this. And the way that most OPM contracts work is they're paid a cut of the tuition revenue for any students that they are able to enroll in programs that they manage. And, our listeners will probably know in higher education, it's against rules, and in some cases, it's against the law for employees of institutions to be compensated on an incentive model that's tied to enrolling students, because that would then incentivize schools to do all sorts of things to get students in the door that may or may not be in those students' best interest. And so the system is sort of set up to protect students in that way. But OPMs for many years have not been subject to those rules. And so schools have paid just exorbitant amounts of money. They've tended to sign long-term contracts with OPMs. I mean, we're talking sometimes 5, 10 year contracts, sometimes even longer, that um, that actually, the schools end up paying sometimes more than half, sometimes 60 to 80% of the tuition revenue for a student that's enrolled into an online program that's being managed by an OPM. The school pays that to the OPM. And again, early on, when schools maybe were forced between, we're either not going to have online education at all because we can't stand it up quickly enough, or we'll have it. As one of our friends and former colleagues used to say, getting 20% of something is better than 100% of nothing. Um, totally appreciate that. But what's happened is that over the many, many years of working with OPMs, most of these schools now have long since built the infrastructure to be able to manage online education themselves. But many times they're still tied into these contracts, where there's just a lot of good questions being asked about OPMs incentives, their motivations to enroll students, what that means for their business practices, and just how just incredibly expensive it is for institutions to be able to work with these OPM partners. So, I mean, those questions have been there for years. Uh, I remember when I was working on the institution side, we were making decisions about whether or not to engage with OPMs. This was 15 years ago, and we were having to ask some of those same questions about, is the contract worth it? But I think, fast forward in early 2023, the Department of Education released what's called a Dear Colleague letter, which is not policy, but it is an early indication of a coming change of policy to the higher ed industry. And this Dear Colleague letter suggested that the protections that had existed for OPMs to be able to essentially operate the way they have and charge based on a percentage of tuition revenue for students enrolled, that they were going to sort of do away with those protections. They were going to classify OPMs as third-party service providers. They were going to unbundle the many, many different services that OPMs tended to bundle together in their contracts, because OPMs, they're not just like delivering course material. They're often doing everything from advertising, recruitment, enrollment, course design. They own the online learning platforms. I mean, everything about online service delivery can be offered by the OPM partner. And so what you end up with is a situation where the institution technically owns the degree, but many, many aspects of its delivery, if not all of its delivery, is being done by this other third party. So the Dear Colleague letter in early 23 said, we're not going to allow OPMs to operate that way anymore. And that was a really important kind of shot across the bow that led to an awful lot of controversy. Not only did many OPM partners start to dig in and prepare to protect their interests, but many in the industry, actually, and even higher ed stakeholders, began to say, wait a minute, the language in this Dear Colleague letter is way too broad. I mean, there are many companies and nonprofit organizations that are offering services to higher education to help them deliver their product to students that are genuinely helpful, that are not exploitative of students, and they would have been probably lumped into the language of this like sea change policy intention that this Dear Colleague letter was expressing. And so the Department of Education slowed things down, responded to that feedback, pushed the deadline back. 2U, one of the largest OPMs in the country, actually filed a lawsuit against the Department of Education to kind of slow this process down, said they had not gone through due process to get, appropriate kind of negotiation involved in some of these policy changes that were coming. And long story short, right toward the end of 2024, the Department of Education just formally rescinded that Dear Colleague letter. So, really, for the last couple of years, 2023 and 2024, heading into this year, we were caught up in the swirl of uncertainty around like what's the actual
Will
policy
they, won't
policy
they?
change, right? Is it going to fundamentally change what OPMs can do, how they have to operate? Um, And so a lot of schools, I think around that time, began to think about, okay, maybe we're going to need to change our relationship to these companies.
Mm.
Um, Many other things happened. People know 2U declared bankruptcy. Lots of things have happened that have signaled maybe some discomfort with a reliance on OPMs to the level that many institutions have relied on them. Early this year, with one of the Biden administration's last efforts at this, they announced again that there would be coming policy change that would govern some of how OPMs are able to operate. The real spirit of this last guidance is a move toward full transparency. So the news is that OPMs, when this policy kind of comes into play at some point in the future, they'll not be able to represent themselves as being kind of one and the same with the institution. So an employee of the OPM can't use an institutional email address, for example, to communicate with students. OPM employees can't refer to themselves as academic counselors or advisors if that's not really their role at the institution. Institutions have to be very, very clear about whether or not it's truly an institutional program or whether it's a program that's being owned and delivered by that OPM. So there's a move toward a lot more transparency, which is of course in our students' best interests to make sure they understand, it's not fair for an institution to represent an online offering as quote unquote exactly the same as the on-campus offering if it's not actually the same, if it's being delivered differently by different people, different faculty, fundamentally different curriculum. And so now there's just going to have to be more transparency about that. So I think that's the latest, at least as far as I can keep up with the ever evolving, twisting, turning saga.
Yeah, I was going to ask you kind of to what you were getting at the end there, even going back to the Dear Colleague letter from a couple of years ago. We started this conversation by saying OPMs actually provided a needed service for these colleges, but I don't know if we got to its impact then on students. So I'm curious, just even the TLDR, if you will, as to why the Dear Colleague letter, why there was, what the intention behind the Dear Colleague letter even was. It's what was it trying to do, to your point, as to how these OPMs operate? What was that impact on the end user of the student that they were trying to change or prevent or avoid by putting out this guidance?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's an effort to prevent the exploitation of students,
Mhm.
very bluntly. And I don't mean to say that all OPMs are doing exploitative things. I just mean that's the spirit of this type of policy guidance is that, you know, we we have to be careful about players in the space, particularly working for accredited not-for-profit institutions of higher learning, to be working according to incentives that would compensate them to get as many students as possible enrolled into these particular programs at whatever cost. So that's fundamentally not necessarily what's in the best interest of the student. And so all of this policy change is meant to, or the signals of coming policy change has been meant to just try to protect students from exploitative practices. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting just even seeing like small things, as in they can't use their .edu email address of the institution if they don't actually work for the institution, if they're working for the OPM, or even things like can't represent an online program as being the same as an on-campus program if there's differences in, prerequisites or the accreditation of the program for the degree that they would receive. To your point, it really seems like it comes back to transparency for the consumer, for the user, which we're seeing more and more of a demand for, not just in higher ed, but across the board. So, with that, it almost feels like the conversations you were talking about that you were having on campus when you were working there, it's it's not that it's being taken out of institutions' hands, it's just that the Department of Education is now being more involved in the conversation to guide institutions as to should they or shouldn't they continue
Yeah.
these relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting the concerns that we hear so often from our client partners working in marketing and admissions leadership positions at these institutions. It's also largely a concern around transparency.
Hmm.
So many of these institutions that have been working with OPMs, they've been kind of oftentimes stuck in these contracts with OPMs, beholden to the OPMs. Um, what we tend to hear a lot is that there's just not nearly the transparency that they wish there was into the ways that those OPMs are, say, marketing these programs or the types of channel and targeting strategies they're using to reach interested prospects. A lot of times, a marketing team at an institution, if you're working with an OPM, it's not like the OPM is typically working like in institution owned systems and advertising accounts and CRM platforms and such. The OPMs are working outside in their own technology and their own systems. And a lot of that feels black boxy, And so if schools are broaching this subject of like, maybe we should get out of these contracts, maybe we should take this back in house and either promote and or deliver our own online programs and do it in house. Well, a lot of things is tricky about pulling back from a contract like that. But one of the things that makes that really difficult is that you might literally lose your entire enrollment marketing infrastructure. um, so it puts schools in a really tricky spot. There's a lot they have to stand up quickly internally and kind of quickly build that capacity to be able to do it themselves.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Again, just it used to be a lot more difficult. That was almost a deal breaker. Not so much anymore. There are resources, there are teams like ours, there are lots of supports out there to help schools if they want to back away from these OPM agreements and start to do it on their own.
Yeah, make it more of an owned effort versus a paid out effort or totally supplemented effort. I think it's also interesting, just this concept of transparency. What you were just hitting on was more so an institution's transparency to their own enrollment marketing or online program efforts and systems in place and so forth. There's also back to that idea of transparency between the student and what they are purchasing or what they're signing up for or what they're enrolling in. It's related to trying to address what we're hearing across the board, which is students are questioning the value of higher education as a whole. So then if they are being misled in any way, shape, or form by the time they enroll in these programs, that's going to do nothing but perpetuate that problem of creating distrust in our industry, which feels like as a united front of people who work in higher education, we obviously want to be on the front of making sure that moves in the right direction.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, one of the challenges with OPMs and some of the complaints that many folks have had about it is that it drives prices up. Like when you're an institution and you have to pay such a considerable cut of any tuition revenue to students enrolled back to an OPM, well, then that incentivizes you to raise prices further in order to then still be able to have enough left over to kind of profit as an institution, and that drives prices up on students. And so, all of this swirling together at a time when student loan debt outstrips credit card debt in our country is just, yeah, it's interesting. The foundations of kind of the model that OPMs have operated on for a long time are really
Yeah.
shaking out underneath them right now.
Yeah, what it's led to intentionally and unintentionally, probably to make the business model make sense. Um, well, Matt, with that, I'm curious then. So, knowing this is that we're talking about something that came out just in the last couple of weeks, that it's really kind of sparking conversation about what the official guidance will be or the official policy changes will be. Curious to, any suggestions or thoughts as to what should institutions be thinking about or doing to adapt or detox from these contracts that might be such a long-standing part of their enrollment marketing efforts.
Yeah, that's a great. I like the word detox. It's because I think, it's easy to say like, oh, well, we'll just pull back from an OPM and begin to do this all on our own. But as with many things where you've been kind of beholden to a partner or beholden to a way of working for a long, long time, it's really difficult to do that cold turkey. It's hard to make that, change overnight. So I think the first thing is if a school is thinking about, hey, we want to maybe pull back from an OPM, take this work in-house. And specifically right now, as a marketing agency, I'm thinking about this through a marketing lens, right? So how are you going to promote these programs, try to like get students enrolled in them? there are other partners better suited to actually weigh in on online program delivery and course design and all those things. That's not our expertise. But when it comes to the enrollment marketing stuff, I mean, I think thing one is you've got to think about restoring critical infrastructure.
Mm.
So, what do we mean by that? I mean, like program pages, lead capture forms, all of your CRM communications infrastructure. In many cases, the OPMs own all of that for the programs that they support. So, I mean, literally, I don't know if students realize this a lot of times, but if you're browsing an institution's online offerings, sometimes you'll notice you'll be on the institution's website and then suddenly you've kind of landed over on a little microsite that seems like it's part of the institution's website, but you also feel like you're in a different world. A lot of times that's because like you're now exploring a program that's owned by an OPM and you are literally on a different website. And sometimes those sites are owned by the OPMs. And so if you pull back from an OPM contract, you lose your public facing program page. So I think that's the first thing we always recommend is take an inventory of what those most critical bits of infrastructure are that the OPM owns and be ready to stand up replacements quickly before you kind of pull the trigger on turning off an OPM support contract. So again, program pages, inquiry forms, or places on your website where you've got those lead capture mechanisms, and then especially those basic lead nurturing communications. So what those comms are that are going to be triggered when a student inquires or applies, making sure you have at least that infrastructure set up on your side, is probably step one. I don't know. What do you think about that, Katie? Does that make sense from kind of a first step?
Yeah, I think completely. I mean, it also goes to as more and more conversations, we could do a whole nother podcast on the value of first party and zero party data. But when you think of what an institution will need to be successful in the future, for them to start having more and more access and ownership over all of those pieces in a prospective student's journey, whether for an online or an on-campus program, it will do nothing but be an asset to them in the future for other marketing campaigns, retention campaigns, whatever it could be. Just even to have historical data to it starts to build that up for an institution versus that being a something they have to rely on a partner for or a program manager for.
Yeah, so I think, the second step, if you've got that critical infrastructure covered, I think the second step starts to be, okay, let's begin to think about the funnel. Let's think about what the OPM was doing that we're now going to need to replace when it comes to promoting these programs and getting interested prospects moving inbound, towards your institution. So step two for me is all about generating leads. Um, we talk about this a lot. You can drive leads into your funnel with paid means, paid advertising, especially, but also bought lists, different ways you can acquire and purchase names or build lists of folks that are interested through paid advertising. But you can also draw people into the funnel organically through content marketing, SEO. And typically, OPMs are doing work on both the kind of drive and draw fronts. So, what we always say to partners is ask/insist that your OPM partners give you all of the data they have with regards to how they've been promoting these programs. I will say many times, especially if they're not contractually bound, they will not give you that. So just prepare for some frustration, or you're going to have to probably fight for it. They're not nearly as transparent as we wish they would be, but ask for the media plans that they've been, launching to promote their programs. Ask for the keyword targeting that they've had set up. Ask for, the way that they've had budget allocated by channel. Ask for the editorial plans they've been using to publish blog articles, to promote these programs if they're supporting them organically. Ask for all of that. Take what you can get from the OPM. Because if nothing else, even if the strategy is not right, you can continue to kind of keep the lights on and execute maybe the strategy they shaped while you're setting up your own strategy and plan. But if you don't get that insight from them or that data from them, then you got to be ready to quickly pivot and stand up your own at least basic lead generation infrastructure quickly. So, we could talk about this probably on a whole other podcast as well. get your tried and true lead generation, paid advertising campaigns in place, particularly on paid search. Um, Again, get those program pages created, optimize them for organic search as best you can, and get basic lead capture forms set up so that you can, get those students inbound. And then you got to start to think about usually promoting to build some awareness for these programs. Um, the other thing I would say on the lead gen side is, again, ask the OPMs for any list strategies they've been pursuing. If they've been purchasing, say, test lists or bought lists, and then targeting those students directly, ask for those names. Now, again, they may not be contractually bound to give you those names. It may be that the OPMs don't have to hand over anything until they literally have an enrolled student in the program. But you can always ask, and maybe contractually there's some leverage you might have. But get those names. If nothing else, see if you can get kind of what lists they were looking to purchase, and so that you can execute those list buys and begin direct outreach to those prospects. Try to get students inbound heading toward the program, because otherwise, you can really see your future term enrollments fall off a cliff if you lead all of that, if you kind of lose all of that lead generation infrastructure overnight.
Yeah, so almost starting foundationally, trying to make sure to your first step, making sure you have the pieces in place. But the second piece would be making sure you are driving traffic to all of these things that you've now set up, whether that's organically through program pages, lead gen forms on landing pages, through paid ads, really trying to get as much as you can. I guess the worst they could say is no. So try to get knowledge is power, get as much as possible, and try to take advantage of even the names that have come in. You can then use those to create lookalike audiences for your paid campaigns. So there's a few different ways you can leverage the information they're providing. If they give you a little, if they give you a lot, and make different moves based off of what becomes available to you to make sure that then you are filling that funnel to drive them to all of the things you've set up. Yeah, I think that
Yeah,
makes total sense.
yeah, absolutely. So if those two steps are in place, I think your third step is really to focus in on your CRM and configure your CRM to be able to really anchor the prospect journey that you want. So again, if step one was all about get the very basics in place, make sure that there's a thank you email that follows up the form fill and some of those basics. But OPMs often manage the entire prospect journey in a black box in their own separate CRM. So along with losing that prospect data on students that maybe are currently in the pipeline, if you're transitioning from an OPM, schools can really underestimate the CRM setup that's required to be able to manage and measure your enrollment marketing operation the way you're going to want to. So I always encourage prospects or prospective clients, first off, try to ensure that the OPM exports to you any prospect data they have for students that are currently in the pipeline and file those records in your own CRM. Again, contractually, they may or may not share that. Um, Ask them for any marketing source attribution data they have on those prospects. Um, Whether or not they give it to you, at least make sure your own CRM is set up to capture marketing source attribution, because you're going to want to notice what of those lead generation efforts that we just talked about deploying are successfully driving students into your funnel, leading to those inquiries and applications. So make sure that's set up. And then really think about the prospect journey that you want for your students. Beyond just basic communications, your OPM may have been doing other things to facilitate the prospect journey. There may have been portals that they offered their students to create these kind of digital environments for them to work through the process, or they may have even owned the applications. So make sure that if there are any of these kind of CRM driven digital experiences or CRM triggered human interaction moments, like advising moments and coaching that you're offering prospects along the way, you really want to think about that prospect journey, map it out, and then set your CRM up as the powerhouse tool that it needs to be to really drive all of that prospect interaction at every step of the journey.
Yeah, I could absolutely see that. So reestablish your foundational pieces so that you own them and are in control of them. You are now moving traffic, driving them to these pages or drawing them to these pages. Now, once they get there, what happens? They complete this form, and then we know that so much of the enrollment cycle is spent in that post-inquiry phase, kind of post-inquiry to app or even post-app to enrollment. So knowing that's the majority of our time, how can we make sure we have the proper triggers set up or experiences set up to move a user to each stage of that funnel? And
Yeah.
along the way, it's just more and more data for us to know what's working and what's not working.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think with our client partners, when those three big steps are in place, at that point we start to go a little next level. We start to think about how do we get more sophisticated in our audience segmentation? How do we start to layer in some maybe smarter list targeting strategies on top of our paid advertising efforts, or even in the deep funnel, how do we help stand up yield focused campaigns to complement maybe what your basic CRM communications flows look like or what your recruiters are doing? So there's a lot more of that kind of next level sophistication that you can start to layer in over time. We love helping our client partners do that. It's really fun for those partners that, are maybe kind of, I think about the difference between sitting there on the verge of pulling back from an OPM contract and just how overwhelming this can feel, to fast forward just a few short months and they actually have all of this infrastructure in place that they're managing themselves, and we're helping them build their internal team's capacity to do this, and just how exciting that is. So that's the journey that we want to really help our partners to go along. But it can feel overwhelming, and I think even the steps that we shared there, the points not to pile on or make it seem like, oh, this is impossible, is quite the opposite. It's possible, but you do need to think through these considerations. And if you're not ready to do that internally, please, whether it's Vision Point or another partner, find the help that you need. Help from a partner that's not going to just try to like step in for the OPM and set up another black boxy thing over here, but a partner that's actually going to help you build this capacity internally.
Evolve it to the next step. No, so with you on that, Matt. And thank you so much for joining us. This was super helpful to get a sense of what's going on, how we even got here, and then also some options or some key priorities for people who are really trying to figure out what to do next on their campus or in their office for their institution. We'll say, just to wrap us up, if you are hearing all of this and wondering what would work best for you and your organization and for your students and their journey to enrollment, please feel free to reach out on visionpointmarketing.com. We're more than happy to do a complimentary consult with Matt or myself and just really take a look at your current state and then how we can almost establish what would be those steps to take to move forward for you to have the ownership over this and to really make sure you're also adhering and staying true to the guidance that we know is going to inform policy in the coming months and making sure you're ahead of that. So with that, Matt, thanks so much again for joining us today. We'll have you back for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. This was fun.